All right, good afternoon. I'm CW5 Chris Braund, head of the Department of Military History at the Warrant Officer Career College. And today we're giving a lunchtime lecture on the Tuskegee Airmen. So today's topic, like we talked about in February, the Tuskegee Airmen. All right, everybody's probably heard stories of the Tuskegee Airmen, right? What are some of the stories you've heard? What are they famous for? Bomber escorts, protecting bombers. What else do we know about them?
Segregated training.
Segregated training. What else? There's a big one. Everybody knows the one thing they're super famous for, and that's how their aircraft were painted. Exactly. The specific thing about the red tails. Everybody's like, oh, they're unique. They're red tail. But then we're gonna dissect that a little bit. We're gonna talk about that red tail and what made it really not unique. That's a takeaway. The Tuskegee Airmen, when you put their record up against other fighter groups of the day, they were actually an average fighter group in unique circumstances, in unique situation. They were in a unique situation being the only black flyers in the Army Air Force. Up till these guys came in, black aviators were not allowed to fly. So that's what makes their story unique. Not necessarily their combat record, not necessarily their kill ratios, their bomber escort missions, what they had to go through and what the path they set forward after combat is what makes them unique. So with that, we'll go ahead and throw out some quick facts right now. So when I say Tuskegee Airmen, everybody automatically thinks of what? The pilots. Everybody's like automatically, the pilots. Well, there's one thing you got to remember. Tuskegee Airmen meant everybody that was involved in the program. So there were 14,000 total Tuskegee Airmen. Of those 14,000, just under 1,000 were the actual aviators. So what do you need to get a pilot in the air? You need everybody else. So that's what this 13,000 ground personnel were. Those are your fuelers, your maintainers, your cooks. And don't even think of it as just men. These are women included in the Tuskegee Airmen. So they were the nurses, clerks, aircraft mechanics, sheet mechanic, all these different jobs that we still have in the Army. They had to do them as well. So that's what you think of when you think of Tuskegee, not just the aviators. Remember, everything that went into it. Also to note, some quick facts. From 1909 until the actual Tuskegee program kicked off, the United States Army, United States Navy, and United States Marine Corps had no black aviators. And it wasn't because none applied. It was because they were not allowed. So that is what makes these guys unique. They're going to shatter that image. All right, one of the big takeaways and one of the big myths about the Tuskegee Airmen is the record. Hollywood and some documentaries have portrayed them as the group that has never lost a bomber. You got to understand, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of bombers in the skies at any given time. There were hundreds of escorts. There were hundreds of German fighters of all sorts. They're going to lose a bomber. And that is what happened. They ended up losing an estimated about 27 bombers. Still not a bad record, but still. The myth of never losing a bomber, they did clearly lose, 27 bombers. And then another thing we're going to talk about today, the painted red tails. Everybody says red tails. That was unique to the Tuskegee Airmen. Yes, their red tails were unique to them, but not unique to the mission. All right? All right, so let's talk about the history of black aviators. So what we have here, we have Domenico Mondelli. Think he's an American aviator? No, absolutely not. Italian. All right. William Robinson Clark. Anybody recognize his uniform? Exactly. He was a British aviator. Hamet Seliktin. I'll just help you out with that one. That's right, the Turkish. Now, Eugene Bullard. He was American. He was an American soldier that wanted to fly. So who do you think he flew for?
France.
Exactly right, he flew for France. For the simple reason of the United States military would not allow African Americans to fly their aircraft. So yes, Eugene Bullard gave everything he had to a cause, to a war in World War I for France. So you'll see that's kind of a pattern that we're gonna talk about here in the early stages of the Tuskegee Airmen. All right, post-World War I. So looking at where the Tuskegee Airmen's lineage comes from and where their actual opportunities started from, you go to post-World War I. But actually, it doesn't even start there. If you think about America's military history and how far back black soldiers have been serving, is it World War I? No, they're all the way back to the founding of the nation. And they've always served with honor and distinction. You know, the 54th Massachusetts in the Civil War. You know, you had American Revolution fighting alongside, you know, the Continentals. War of 1812, you name it. And then finally, World War I. Now, the issue with post-World War I is what came out afterwards. You know, civil rights movement kind of starting to get a little gear, kind of getting a little momentum going. So the United States Army War College commissions a study to see exactly how the African American can perform in the white man's army. Is the gist of this study. And I do have copies of it if anybody's interested in seeing it. So their study looked at all of the black soldiers during World War I. Now, what they did not look at was certain units. They handpicked which units they were going to look at. And the units they looked at were the support units. So your truck drivers, you know, your cooks, all your different types of support is what they kind of studied. And they came to some pretty jarring conclusions. Inferior mentality. Inherently weak in character. And then the other two, as a technician and a fighter, inferior to the white man. Basically saying black soldiers could not handle technical things such as flying an airplane. That is what this War College study is setting up. Now, again, that's who they studied. What they failed to study were the 369th Infantry Regiment and the other infantry regiment that was assigned to the French. These guys became known as the Harlem Hellfighters. Do you get that nickname from being not so good in combat, probably? You earn a nickname generally by what you do in combat. And that's exactly what the Harlem Hellfighters did. They were an American infantry regiment out of New York that did not fight with the American Army. They were put underneath the French, kind of like Eugene Bullard's unique story. He's an American pilot, flew for the French. So you can see their record. 170 equivalent Medal of Honors from the French, 2 of our own Medal of Honors, and 191 days total under fire. And when you look at 191 days, you need to understand when America got in the war. America got in the war in April of 1917, and the war was over by November of 1918. So when you think where these guys were fighting, they were in combat. As soon as America sent soldiers over, these gentlemen were placed underneath the French and immediately sent to the front lines. So that's what makes it unique and kind of a not necessarily, you know, kind of makes it a flawed study almost based on who they were looking at. So we'll see how this kind of progresses. All right. Moving forward into the 20s and into the early 1930s, aviation is booming in America. We got all of the surplus aviation left over from World War I. And those of you that are interested, after this presentation, one of those big boom aircraft, the JN-4 Jenny, there's an example of it in the World War I section. They were so mass produced and then sold for about $50. In today's term, that's probably like $1 million, but they were just kind of sold everywhere, and they became the barnstormers. They were just, aviation was booming. And it wasn't particular just to white aviators. Black Americans wanted to fly too. So they picked up these aircraft and started flying. The only problem is things weren't necessarily open to them as it was to white aviators. Licensing and things like that. So they started petitioning to get licensing open. They started petitioning to get the same type of opportunities that the white aviators were getting. So a particular group took off from a remote airfield one day from Illinois and flew to Washington, D.C., landed, and went into the halls of Congress. They met a young senator. This young senator was from Missouri. And this is what he told them after seeing what these guys flew. We're talking about duct tape, string holding together airframes. The Jennies back there. These were real beat up Jennies, not top quality. So this senator says, if you guys had the guts enough to fly that thing from Chicago, I got guts enough to do all I can to help you. That guy was Harry S. Truman. So Harry S. Truman, forefront of trying to figure out how to solve this problem. And then by the end of this presentation, you'll see where Harry S. Truman actually fits into this history. But here's where it starts. All right, let's talk about some notable people. All right, you can't talk about the Tuskegee Airmen without talking about some of the most notable people. I got two famous people sitting in this aircraft right here. And an example of this aircraft, this is a J3 Cub that they're both sitting in right now. There's a J3 Cub in the back to kind of give you a perspective of what this aircraft, the size and what it could hold. Anybody recognize who this is in the back? That's Eleanor Roosevelt, First Lady of the United States. This is Charles Chief Anderson. When America was kind of sensing war waves, when they were trying to build up an aviation bench, so to speak, they started offering up civilian pilot training programs to white universities until enough petitioning happened that black universities, and one of those specific ones was Tuskegee Institute in Tuskegee, Alabama. And this guy right here became the chief instructor pilot of that program. Hence the name Charles Chief Anderson. Kind of works out that way. So this picture depicts a day during this flight training that Eleanor Roosevelt just happened to be in Tuskegee. She was visiting one of her projects she was excited about, and then she had heard rumors that black aviators couldn't fly, that there's no such thing as black aviators. She had heard this rumor based on what we talked about earlier, the War College study and whatnot. So she goes to this place called Kennedy Field. Tuskegee had 3 auxiliary airfields, and Kennedy Field was one of these auxiliary airfields. Chief Anderson was flying pilots. She shows up and says, hey, I want an airplane ride. So naturally, she gets her airplane ride. First Lady asks, and everybody jumps. This is the picture when they got back. So her story, now, a lot of folklore, a lot of documentaries, and a lot of kind of, false narratives say she alone is credited for establishing the Tuskegee Airman program. In fact, what she is credited for is taking those auxiliary airfields at a time when Tuskegee was trying to establish one single airfield. She is credited with pulling strings and getting the funding for one airfield. And that airfield's called Moton Airfield. And we'll talk about that one here in a second. That became the primary and pre-flight training area for the original Tuskegee Airmen and the rest of the Tuskegee Airmen as they progressed through World War II. What that is the airfield that is still there today that the Tuskegee National Museum is sitting on. So that airfield is still operational today thanks to Eleanor Roosevelt. All right, the next gentleman, Noel Parrish. He was a captain when he was first assigned to the Tuskegee Airmen. Tuskegee Airmen and the pilot training program went through a series of commanders. And it was Noel Parrish was the first one that actually had sympathy towards the black aviators. Before that, they had guys that still believed in segregation. They kept the cadet aviators out of the officer clubs. He was the first one that said, no, I'm going to join the African American Officers Club. I'm going to integrate all of my activities. So what he became an honorary Tuskegee Airman, they called him. So he's in one of the Tuskegee Airmen Hall of Fames. He's pretty well known, and actually one of the guys that kind of got the program, make sure it didn't fail. It's kind of his claim to fame. Another notable guy, Benjamin O. Davis. Benjamin O. Davis was number 4, was the 4th African American to graduate from West Point. All right, pretty unique in itself. He was ostracized by all of his friends there and still graduated pretty high up in his class. He, while in college, applied for the Army Air Corps. Naturally was denied based on policies of the day. So he spent some time in the infantry, cavalry, until finally the Tuskegee program kicked off. And he was immediately, as a captain, rather a junior lieutenant, sent to Tuskegee to be one of the first cadets, and he would ultimately lead the first African American pursuit squadron called the 99th, and we'll talk about them in a second. Charles Hall, credited with the first German shoot down by an African American pilot in the war. It was a mission that they were flying over North Africa. They just happened to spot two German Focke-Wulf 190s. Not necessarily looking to get in a dogfight, but just took advantage of the opportunity, because at this point, they'd been over there for a few months, they've had no combat, and they seized on an opportunity to finally get in the record books. And that's what Charles Hall did. He rolled in, shot one of them down. His flight leader, Charles Dryden. Now he's famous not so much for everything he did during the war, but he is credited with a lot of what we know after the war. He wrote a memoir called A-Train, which just happens to be the same name he painted on his airframe as well. And if anybody wants to see it, I do have a copy of it over here. Alexander Jefferson, basic Tuskegee Airman. His claim to fame is he was a POW. Now, POW, you're looking at like, oh, POW. He was shot down over Germany, sent to one of their prison camps where he thought things were going to be kind of the same way that they are back home. Segregated, kept away from everybody. He's credited with, or he's quoted as saying it was a unique experience being in a Nazi prison camp, being kept with the white officers, being treated equal to the white officers, and then went home and was segregated. That was he was like, it's kind of ironic what I just went through. So kind of an eye-opening experience that gets the civil rights movement, gets some juice behind it. All right, now let's talk about finally coming to fruition. Talking about the Tuskegee Airmen are finally sitting inside some airplanes. 1939, the Civil Pilot Training Act was passed. This is the program where 20,000+ aviators are needed to fill Army Air Corps and then eventually Army Air Force cockpits. The problem is black soldiers weren't allowed in the Army Air Corps. So what do you do? So that's what an amendment was passed to at least allow them to train civilian. Not in the Army Air Corps yet, but just as civilian pilots. So that's what this program did. So they were all at Moton Field, or the 3 auxiliary airfields at Tuskegee before Moton Field. They were just training and just being pilots in the pool. And then finally, the re-election, the third term of Franklin Roosevelt. Now, what's unique about his third term, well, it's third term of a president, that's unique enough, but this is where Franklin Roosevelt started looking at the population of voters and what he can do to maybe secure some extra votes. And to secure some of that, he started listening to civil rights activists. And what do you think probably one of the biggest things some of the recent civil rights activists were trying to get done? What do you think? Trying to get black soldiers in the Army Air Corps. So he listened to that and made an announcement. The Army Air Corps will be accepting black applicants. Instant success right there. Not necessarily the sole reason for re-election, but definitely a big part of the re-election. So in January 1941, the plan is established. March of 1922, the plan for the first all-black fighter squadron was established. The 99th Fighter Squadron established at Chennault Field in Illinois. The funny part was no pilots were in that squadron. You have a fighter squadron made up entirely of enlisted soldiers. Remember we said 13,000+ Tuskegee Airmen? You gotta start somewhere, and that's what these guys were. They were going to be the aviator, or they were going to be the aviation mechanics. and the guys, the fuelers, the cooks, all the service support was established in Chennault Field. Then the argument became, you can't train up here. It's Illinois. What's it like half the year? Cold, rainy, snowy. So now the fight became, where do we establish the training, the Army Air Corps, the Army Air Force training for the Tuskegee Airmen? Well, there just happened to already be training going on down in Tuskegee. Moton Field, you know, all the training. Chief Anderson, all these guys were already down there. So the Army Air Corps established the plan for Tuskegee Army Airfield. Now, Tuskegee Army Airfield is still there today, but it's privately owned. So if you're at Moton Field, about 7 miles away is Tuskegee Army Airfield. And when I say still there, the runways. And then kind of a monument that says, here, this is what was here. But right now, there's no buildings and whatnot. And then by August 21st, the first class was already there. All right, so that training we talked about. So we talked about all the auxiliary airfields. We talked about Moton Field coming to fruition. Well, Moton Field was the civilian run with military personnel there. So it was the contract site. So what the pilots did here is this is where they got pre-flight and primary training. Pre-flight would be, this is all their academics, all their ground school, aeromed, you know, how to properly, you know, wear their uniform. That's kind of everything that was going on there. And then primary flight training in the PT-13, or the Stearman, as some of us know it. This is where they would learn basic maneuvers, you know, not aerobatics, nothing like that, just basically how to do traffic patterns, how to take off safely, how to land safely. That was what they did. And those that could graduate this training went on to Tuskegee Army Airfield, where they got their advanced training, their basic and advanced training. And the BT-13 was for basic, and this is just your basic two-seat aircraft, aerobatic, so they're learning a little bit more maneuvers. And then they would move into those that would move into the fighter concept would move into the AT-6. Now I said fighter. You need to be aware that there were two pipelines for these guys. Those that could qualify would move into the fighters. There were also bomber. Everybody heard of the Tuskegee Airman bomber pilots? And we'll talk about them at the end. They kind of got the short end of that stick. Once the training was done, this is it. They weren't sent overseas. They were the 99th Fighter Squadron sitting at Tuskegee Army Airfield waiting for a job, waiting for a chance. The war is kicked off. You know, 1941 ends. We roll into 1942 and they're still looking for a chance. And that's where they're sitting as everything is building. All right, so let's get into the makeup of the Tuskegee Airmen and who they were. Everybody knows just red tails. You know, we don't know, you know, a lot of people don't take the time to kind of look at exactly how they fit in the Air Force structure. So all said and done, when the 99th Fighter Squadron finally moved out, and we'll break that down, how that happened, they were assigned to the 12th United States Air Force, 12th Army Air Force. They were going to be operating in North Africa. That was their first area of operation. North Africa, pushing all the way to the eastern coast of Africa, and then moving into Sicily, and then Italy is where these guys operated. While these guys were overseas, the 332nd Fighter Group was established. The 332nd Fighter Group consisted of 100th, 301st, and 302nd, all black fighter groups, constituting the first all black fighter group. All right? Eventually, all of these guys would come together underneath the 332nd, move from the 12th Air Force, where they were more ground tactical support, moving over to the 15th Air Force, where they became bomber escorts. All right, the next thing, let's talk about airframes. This is where things kind of get confusing. So I put the squadron emblem so everybody would kind of follow along. So I talked about Tuskegee Army Airfield, when the Tuskegee Airmen were just sitting waiting for an assignment. This is what they were flying. This is the P-40. Now, this is not even the top of the line P-40. These are the hand-me-downs. These are the ones that are breaking. These are the ones where we're lucky if it's got all the props on it. This is what they were training on. And this is what the 99th was flying when they were sent to North Africa. All right? The next airframe that the 100th, 301st, and 302nd got when they got their assignment to move overseas, they were flying the P-39 Airacobra. I don't know if anybody knows what this airframe is, but this airframe was so bad that it was the one we lend-leased to Russia, just because it was not something our guys wanted to fly. Both of these airframes right here, this one was a fighter. This one had the P just because it was maneuverable. This airframe was designed for close air support, ground strafing and whatnot, not necessarily dueling with German airframes. So putting these two together, you kind of get an indicator of what the Tuskegee Airmen's mission was going to be. Does it sound like they were going to be bomber escort high flyers doing all the glory that the P-47s, the P-38, P-51s, those guys? These guys were going to do the mission that the Army Air Force felt was beneath them, ground support, which if we start peeling the onion back, that is where the United States Army and the United States Army Air Force started separating their ideals. The Army Air Force wanted to keep going higher, further, faster. The Army ground force needed close air support. So eventually what happened after World War II, those two split. The United States Army Air Force and all their high, fast flyers became the United States Air Force. All of those guys that stayed low to the ground, the close air support, eventually became the helicopters, eventually became all the close air support. That's what these guys were. These guys established that doctrine. These guys established that precedent as they were flying. All right, once these things eventually finally fell apart and they couldn't fly them anymore, the entire group, for a brief period of time, came into the beautiful P-47 Thunderbolt. This thing was the tank in the sky. It could duel with fighters, but again, it is a close air support airframe. Very rugged, very tough, and could strafe, carry bombs, could do everything. So it was still more in the close air support. It wasn't until the entire fighter group moved over to the 15th Air Force, moved up into Italy, that we finally started getting variants of the P-51. All right, first they were flying the Alpha and the Bravo models, hand-me-downs, until finally enough petitioning from Washington, D.C. and leadership, they got the P-51D. And you can see this one is painted up with their famous red tails, and we're going to talk about those red tails. All right, so the tail of the tails, all right? Again, 332nd Fighter Group, red tail, not taking that away. But what's unique about that is the 306 Fighter Wing was one of two fighter wings in the 15th Air Force. The other one was a P-38 Fighter Wing. Of the 306th Fighter Wing, 4 fighter groups were in that wing. Each fighter group had a unique tail designation. And that also was not unique to the 15th Air Force. The 8th Air Force, every other Air Force had unique tail designation, because the bomber pilots who were looking for their escorts don't want to read, well, who is QP? Who does that guy belong to? Or MX or 98, what are these guys? The bomber pilots began to recognize their escorts by what their tails looked like. So you can see each one was definitely unique. And that was how the P-51s, who became the primary primary bomber escorts, that's why all their tails. If you look at pictures of World War II P-51s, this is how they were unique. Now, getting into where these guys actually served. All right, the big picture of World War II, what's going on? Pearl Harbor, 1941. All right, kind of action was going on in the Pacific. Nothing was really going on over here until November of 1942. November of 1942, Operation Torch. That was the Allied invasion of North Africa. So Operation Torch kicks off, and then finally in April of 1943, is when the 99th Pursuit Squadron, or 99th Fighter Squadron by then, receives orders to move over. They had finally made it. They had finally said, okay, we've proven our time and we're coming over to North Africa. So they sit. They're assigned to the 33rd Fighter Group, an all-white fighter group. The all-black fighter squadron assigned to the all-white fighter group. Didn't really mix well. Their commander, the Colonel Spike Momeyer, is who they fell under. Colonel Spike Momeyer, not a big fan of his 99th Pursuit Squadron. So much so that he never included them in their briefings. He never gave them missions. His pilots wouldn't keep up, wouldn't brief them. Matter of fact, the only briefing these guys got sometimes was, hey, keep up with us. That was their briefing. That was their mission brief. So naturally, the first couple months, they're not really producing. So Momeyer sends a letter back saying these guys are worthless. They're not producing on the levels of my other guys. Well, fantastic. So now we move them. Maybe it's just the area they're in. Now we move the Tuskegee Airmen in June of 43. Still under the 33rd Fighter Group, kind of spicing them in with the 324th Fighter Group. Still the same results. We've only got 1 or 2 victories. So they're not really producing according to Momeyer. So these guys are almost disbanded. They're trying to say the Tuskegee Airman experiment has failed. This is when Benjamin O. Davis, remember I said Benjamin O. Davis was in charge of the 99th. He goes back to Washington to fight. He's fighting with a gentleman who was his father. All right, trying to give you a little bit of background. His father was Benjamin O. Davis Sr. Benjamin O. Davis Sr. was the first black general in the United States Army. There was a time where there was only 2 commissioned officers, black officers in the Army. Benjamin O. Davis Sr., Benjamin O. Davis Jr. So these are pretty powerful guys that go to Washington and say, hey, look, this is what we're up against. This is what we're doing. We are doing everything we can with what we have. So just in time for that, Operation Husky kicks off. All right, minimal success, but it's the next one. Benjamin O. Davis is now given command of the 332nd. The Tuskegee Airmen have proven themselves as viable close air support guys throughout the North Africa and the Husky campaigns. So Benjamin O. Davis is given the opportunity to take the entire 332nd back over to the European theater and get moved under the 15th Air Force. So now you have all Tuskegee Airmen in an air base called Ramitelli Air Base, now bomber escorts. The mission that every Army aviator at the time dreamed of. No Army aviator dreamed of close air support in North Africa, covering amphibious landings. They all dreamed of the opportunity for bomber escort. So now they started taking bombers into the remnants of Italy, into Germany, all the way into Berlin on a couple missions. So they finally proved themselves enough in combat that they were giving equal mission to the other white aviators. So again, as I started off this class saying, nothing they did was unique. They did the exact same missions. They had eventually the exact same airframes. They had the exact same training, but it was the adversity they had to get over. You know, they had different mentalities as well when we get into that. The 8th Air Force to the north, the guys that were in England flying down into Germany, they had a philosophy of fighters attack fighters. 15th Air Force philosophy was stay with the bombers. That goes against everything a fighter pilot's ever built to do. He is not designed to escort a bomber and not chase a fighter. So when that mission was given to the 332nd and the guidance of stay with the bombers, they followed that guidance. And that's why they didn't lose as many bombers as other guys, because they stayed with the bombers and they would only peel off if they were directly attacked. All right, so overall, this is the record. 352 pilots actually went into combat, flying a total of 578 missions. 744 air medals. Of that, 150 became Distinguished Flying Crosses, Bronze Stars, presidential citations. They included 115 aircraft shot down, to include some of the first jets in combat, the ME-262s. They did lose 66 pilots. 32 of them became prisoner of war, and then 13 of them are still missing in action. Now, I talked about the bombers, the forgotten Tuskegee Airmen. You don't hear about these guys. All right, they weren't all destined to be fighter pilots. They were trying to establish a bomber group as well. The 477th Bomber Group, made up of the 616, 617, 618th, and 619th. These guys were going to be the first all-black bomber crew. The problem was they weren't co-located in Tuskegee. These guys were up in Illinois still. And the racially charged area, these guys tried to take a stand one time and tried to enter the all-white officer club. They got in an altercation. They all got arrested. It became a big issue up there that eventually these guys got so wrapped into all the red tape, everything that was going on up there, they never actually got to go to combat. So a lot of that was going on while the 332nd was over there. So a lot of that was weighing on the experiment, as they were calling it. All right. So their legacy, all right? What do we think their legacy was? Anybody want to take a stab? So we go through everything these guys did. What is their legacy? What's that?
The War College paper.
There it is right there. So that War College paper stated they couldn't do what they did, right? The War College paper said that there's no physical way these guys could have flown, and they did it. They got up there and they proved it. What about as far as military policy afterwards? These guys kind of led the way for the desegregation of the military. Remember I said President Truman, where he was in the beginning of this history. President Truman was the guy that signed the executive order that desegregated the military. So he is definitely, you saw from the very beginning his quote saying, I'm going to do everything I can to get you guys to fly. Well, that all came to fruition when he was the president of the United States at the end of World War II. And in 1948, he signed the executive order. And then I believe it was after the Korean War when everything was finally desegregated. So yeah, when you look at their overall record, when you look at their overall job, they were on par with everybody else. It was just what they had to do to get there. And then they proved that yes, black aviators, black soldiers, because while these guys are in the air, remember, there's guys on the ground too. There's tank battalions, infantry divisions, proving themselves that yes, we're not inferior. We can fight too. And then all of that combined gets a desegregation of the military. And you see it today. Their legacy still continues. You know, so that's a pretty impressive record for a group that on paper on par, but then the legacy they've left for everybody.